Bonjour tout le monde. Hello everyone. We will wait 2-3 minutes more to see if anyone joins us else online or in person. And then we'll start giving a warm welcome to our fantastic speaker, Professor Juan de Dios Incunegui.
Bienvenidos, welcome, bonjour tout le monde. We will wait for 5 minutes. Hein? Bonjour les étudiants, les étudiantes. Dear students. So, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, dear colleagues, dear students from the University of Luxembourg, from University Sangor online, and also Sciences Po Rennes online, and from other partner institutions. First of all, I would like to warmly thank my Spanish-speaking colleagues from the chair, Monica Velasco Puflo, Laura Gilles Besada, and Serena Castea, with whom we are actively strengthening our cooperation with Spanish-speaking parliamentary studies centers, like the Center of the Université Austral, but also the Center of Legislative Studies of the Universidad Complutense de Madrid. It's a great pleasure to welcome you this evening for the opening of the first seminar of 2026 in our series dedicated to comparative and European legislative studies. And we are truly honored to welcome our distinguished colleague, Professor Juan de Dios Quincunegui, from the Centro Internacional de Estudios Investigación y Perspectiva Parlamentarios at the School of Politics and Government and International of la Universidad Austral. His lecture tonight is entitled Parliaments and at the Center of the Storm, Why Democracy Has No Future Without Modern, Effective, and Truly Representative Institutions. At this time when representative democracy are under intense pressure, this conference invites us to bring parliaments back to the very center of political and institutional reflection by questioning their capacity to adapt, to represent, and to remain effective in a rapidly changing world. Unfortunately, as you may notice, I'm not able to be with you physically this evening for personal reasons. But before giving the floor to my estimated Argentine colleague, I would like to mention I will give you some reflections, that I developed recently in a new small article just published this morning in La Nouvelle Revue Politique. And after, I will let the floor to my colleague. So, as you know, in the late 70s, a very famous American sociologist, Ronald Inglehart, published a book, The Silent Revolution. And in this book, he demonstrated how deep transformations in socio-economic, socio-political, and social-cultural cleavages within Western democracy generate a gradual electoral and political realignment. This process unfolded largely to the detriment of traditional parties, governing parties, that they dominated Western democracy since the end of the Second World War. At the core of this transformation lay a structural opposition between materialist and post-materialist values systems. Materialist values emphasize in economic growth, employment as a source of personal and collective stability, national identity as a foundation of social cohesion, and the preservation of a clearly defined political and social order rooted in historical and cultural tradition, notably Judeo-Christian heritage in Europe and in the Americas. By contrast, post-materialist values prioritize individual freedoms, environmental protection, sustainable models, including forms of economic moderation or degrowth, and a conception of democracy less strictly anchored in judicial constitutional frameworks and representative institutions. Democracy in this perspective was increasingly conceived as a participatory and deliberative and everyday practice, grounding in the equal recognition of individual and group-based claims, and often accompanied by cultural and political egalitarianism or relativism. These values shift also encourage greater acceptance of global or multi forms of political decision making associated with governance rather than government. The interaction and conflict between these two value systems reshaped political competition. New political formation emerged both outside and within traditional party system and contributing to the increasing fragmentation. A lot of political parties on the center right, on the center left, social democracy, liberal centrist, Christian democracy, etc., were particularly affected by this movement and in different ways across Europe and Americas. The return of materialism provokes the rise, notably of new leftist parties or new rightist party, what we call the rise of new political parties in the framework of new political cleavages. On this part of this recomposition of political system, in particular in Western democracy and recently in Europe and also in Latin America, we see the emergence and the development of conservative liberal, liberal national, or far right or populist right wing parties. Their program are structured around economic security, social stability, national sovereignty, immigration control, and the effectiveness of public action. Importantly, this resurgence of materialism does not entail a rejection of democracy. On the contrary, this movement often promotes a redefinition of democratic legitimacy centered on representative government, parliamentary sovereignty, and majoritarian accountability in opposition to governance based on models perceived as technocratic, diffuse, and insufficiently accountable. Representative governments thus remain their preferred regime, where post-materialist movements tend to favor governance arrangements involving non-elected actors, transnational institutions, and participatory mechanisms at the local level or at the national level that partially bypass traditional parliamentary mediations. But if we want to understand this transformation, we have also to focus and to understand the three conceptions of democracy intentions. First of all, we have the classical procedural democracy, analyzed notably by C.B. Macpherson, and all Western democracy, they are procedural democracy. This conception rests on the primacy of law and legal procedure, defining democracy as government through within the rule of law. It underpins the functioning of contemporary democratic regime and is actively promoted by institutions such as the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe, for example, in Europe. The second conception is normative democracy, very well analyzed by José Verling, a Canadian also sociology professor of constitutional law, and Joseph Verlaine underlines that the liberal democracy rely on dense normative frameworks, constitutions, international treaties, and Declaration of Rights or Bill of Rights, rooted in the liberal democratic traditions of the French and American revolutions. Constitutional and Supreme Courts play a central role in safeguarding these frameworks and enforcing demanding standards of fundamental rights and the rule of law. The third and increasingly influential conception is a redemptive democracy theorized by Margaret Canavan, based on the idea of a morally unified people seeking direct, continuous, and meaningful participation in political life. Redemptive democracy manifests itself through referendum, popular initiative, demonstration, participatory and deliberative mechanism, and permanent forms of control over elected representatives, including recall procedure. These three democratic logics, procedural, normative, and redemptive, coexist and interact, placing representative democracy under increasing strain. Contemporary democracy thus experiences a gradual shift from government to governance marked by fragmented authority, multi-level decision making, and diluted political responsibility. And that is really important to underline that. Finally, just to mention some last general election or in Europe and in Latin America. In Portugal, recently, at the beginning of January, the presidential election was characterized by a high abstention, but it was also characterized by the rise of the far-right party Chega, which became the second political party. It's also these similar patterns emerge in Latin America, for example, in the election in Bolivia, in Argentina, and in Chile between 2024 and 25, underscore profound political realignment. In Argentina, the parliamentary consolidation of President Javier Milei's libertarian movement combined radical or pseudo-radical market-oriented economic policies with a strong claim to fiscal and national sovereignty. In Chile, the recent victory of José Antonio Cast at the presidential election marked a decisive rejection of post-materialist constitutional experiments rooted in deliberative and participatory ideals, reaffirming a conservative and economically libertarian agenda. Despite significant differences in economic structures, social inequalities, and historical trajectory, these cases share a common trait: the reassertion of materialist demand for economic security, effective governance, and sovereign decision-making within a democratic framework. Finally, the election of 2025 and recently 2026 across Europe and Americas revealed both the fragmentation of political system and the diversification of democratic practices and conception. Socioeconomic and social-cultural cleavages exist in all liberal democracies, regardless of their level of development or institutional history. The contemporary rise of different political parties, far right or radical left, can thus be understood not as an anomaly, but a part of a broader historical pattern in which society seeks to re-embed economic and political change within a framework of social protection, sovereignty, and democratic legitimacy. In modern times, and that I would like to underline that particularly, the Greek word oikos, remains inseparable from the politeia, a lesson that contemporary democracy ignores has at their peril. However, and finally, the political realignment cannot be democratically consolidated unless we return to the foundation of our shared political regime, representative government. In this perspective, parliaments, through their deliberative function and their votes and their roles, in legislations, oversight, sanctioning, policy assessment, and legislative initiative, must remain central actor in addressing the economic, social, cultural, and environmental issue at the heart of our society, whether in Americas or in Europe. Thank you for your attention, and I will let the floor to our distinguished colleague from the Universidad Austral.
Thank you very much, Professor Poirier. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. It's a pleasure, really. Thank you for your time, for your interest. Yeah, please, thank you. Thank you to all of you. Well, it is a true honor and a huge privilege to be here at the University of Luxembourg, sharing this conference with you. I would like to especially thank Professor Philippe Poirier and Professors Laura Gil Besada and Mónica Velasco Puflu for the invitation, the trust and the academic generosity that made this meeting possible. I really expect to listen your opinion at the end. This space has a very special value for me, not only because of the opportunity to dialogue with academics and students who observe democracy from different traditions, experiences, and trajectories, but because I sincerely believe that we are facing a debate that transcends any national context and that challenges the very core of contemporary democratic governance. Let me begin with two simple questions. What are we going to talk about today? And why did I travel so many kilometers to be here in Luxembourg, in the heart of Europe? I will answer the first one now and the second one at the end of the dissertation. Before that, however, I need to make a methodological warning that I consider central to understanding the approach I'm going to propose. I'm not going to talk about ideologies. I'm not going to talk about political parties. I'm not going to classify countries as good and bad. Not because these issues don't matter, they matter a lot, but because, in my opinion, they don't explain the central problem I want to address this afternoon. I'm going to speak concretely and deliberately about the exercise of political power, how it works in practice, and its tendency to concentrate. What happens when there are no limits, controls, or standards proportional to its capacity to do harm. When I use the word storm in the title of this conference, I do not do so as a rhetorical metaphor or as an exaggerated device. We are experiencing an overlap of systematic risk, big crises that operate simultaneously and reinforce each other. Environmental and climate crisis, demographic crisis, particularly here in Europe, migration crisis, food and humanitarian crisis, technological crisis, one of whose most profound impacts is the widening of the digital divide and the transformation of human work and all other aspects of modern life as we know it today, which are gradually beginning to fall apart. Crisis in employment and social protection systems, crisis caused by poverty and profound inequality, security crisis associated, among other factors, with the escalation, sophistication, and complexity of transnational organized crime and the growing increase in cybercrime. Arms race and proliferation of armed conflicts, crisis of multilateralism, crisis of worsening interreligious and cultural conflicts, an educational and values crisis, coinciding with an unprecedented revolution in scientific and technological innovation, centered on generative artificial intelligence and new technologies due to their brutal impact on the society of the future. Crisis in public communication, marked by disinformation and fake news, mental health crisis, privacy crisis in a world where everything that happens is listened to, recorded, stored, processed, and used, who knows for what purposes, sometimes commercial, sometimes for security, sometimes for intelligence, making our lives and those of our family members, colleagues, and like-minded communities increasingly fragile and vulnerable to external interference. Crisis of corruption and capture of power, crisis of transparency and accountability, crisis of confidence and democratic legitimacy, geopolitical crisis, and finally, global governance crisis. A little long list. This is not an arbitrary list. However, you can surely list other crises because the transformation we are undergoing at this stage of humanity and its consequences are numerous. All these crises exist, are documented with empirical evidence, and directly affect the stability of our societies. But there is something even more important to highlight. They do not act in isolation. They are interconnected. They reinforce each other. They feed off each other. And they exert simultaneous pressure on political systems throughout the world, with no nation managing to fully escape their effects. The global governance crisis is not just another one in this set. It is in fact the expression of the collective inability to manage all the previous ones. Humanity has always experienced crises. What is truly new is not each crisis individually, but their scale, impact, simultaneity, acceleration, and interdependence. Crises no longer occur one after another, they overlap. Decision must be made faster and faster. Time for deliberation is reduced, and the potential damage of mistakes is multiplied. Not very nice scenario, but it's the reality. When political systems are subjected to this level of stress, history shows a recurrent pattern. Power tends to become concentrated. The justification is usually familiar: to make decisions faster. But this concentration of power and this management style have profound structural costs. Herein lies a central paradox. Politics is at the same time the greatest instrument of collective solution that humanity has created, and one of the greatest historical risk factors. So both sides. There is no other field with such a capacity to prevent catastrophes, but there is also no other with such a capacity to cause them. The problem is not the state as an abstraction. The problem is concentrated political power, which governs the state through governments run by specific individuals with names and surnames, positions and decisions that have real effects on the lives of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, and even billions of people worldwide. Democracies integrate popular sovereignty with strict legal terms, limits on power, including the separation of powers, a conceptual framework that might seem sufficient to distinguish between legitimate and despotic governments. However, the evidence shows that democratic decline is accelerating, and not only due to the direct action of authoritarian regimes, but also, and this is crucial, due to the citizens' own choices, as they increasingly lose faith in liberal democracies, which they perceive as a fiction, a formal system that promises much and delivers little. This then raises a central question. Why, after so much effort to establish and expand liberal democracies around the world, are the risks of power accumulation increasing and deviations becoming more and more frequent? Has democracy failed? Did it become an outdated concept? The answer is no. It wasn't democracy as a concept that failed, but its implementation. When we have seen, although we have not yet taken due note, is that during the short history of modern democracy, the rule has been the constant and widespread development of fissures that allow and have allowed rulers to deviate from the path, skip the rules, pretend to comply with them, or directly violate them without any consequence. The systematic production of micro and macro violations of the letter and spirit of the laws, including and especially the constitutional regime under whose framework they operate, has been and continues to be the main cause of their deterioration. And this leads us to a new question. Why do societies that enjoy free elections allow these repeated deviations, even knowing that they put their own stability at risk? Let me introduce a practical example. Let's imagine the democracy is a vehicle. Politics is the fuel. The state apparatus is the engine with its complex engineering, and politicians are the drivers. If we tolerate losses, pollution, and poor quality of that fuel, deliberately and constantly diluted by drivers seeking undue benefits, passing off good fuel as bad fuel, the vehicle's engine will sooner or later break down and may even fail, size up, or stop working. This is exactly what is happening to many of our countries today and has been happening since the origin, most of them, by the way, limited to demanding democracy and suitable institutions as a basic condition to try to provide prosperity, but unable to make them work properly. The central problem, in my opinion, is that we have underestimated politics, the political and government system, and politicians themselves. We haven't demanded strict adherence to the standards they should always have met, nor have we demanded their timely adaptation to modern times. And here appears the conceptual core of this conference. If we want to avoid democratic collapse, we must rethink these three factors: politics, the political and governmental system, and politicians as activities of systemic and critical risk. In fields such as nuclear energy, aviation, or critical care medicine, no one blindly trusts the science or the technique of these activities, nor their inputs, nor the organization created to provide these services, nor the individual virtue of those who lead them. In contrast, there are strict protocols, redundancies, independent audits, and organizational cultures focused on prevention and recurring learning from mistakes. These activities with a very high level of demand designed to minimize errors to the extreme. The democratic paradox is that the power with the greatest capacity for harm is at the same time the least protocolized and the one that most depends on the self-restraint of those who will it. This phenomenon of permissiveness and underestimation of politics is not new. It is at the same time an undeniable reality. However, it is completely absent from the public agenda and even from the agenda of academic studies and research on good governance. The proposal I bring to your attention consists, firstly, in giving this approach the importance it truly deserves. It is a serious existential problem that we have been dealing with since the beginning of modern democracy. We have identified the problem. It is time to begin exploring the possible construction of a new political theory, that of the systematic and critical risk of politics, of the political and government system, and of politicians themselves, as well as the need to assign to that risk, consequently, an appropriate response. The interesting thing is that its development requires absolute impartiality. The focus should be on the engineering of that triad, without distinguishing ideologies, evaluating government plans or programs, and not even judging ends. What we want to analyze is how power is exercised today and how to ensure that in the future its exercise is as controlled as a nuclear power plant, a commercial flight, or a heart transplant. Some may interpret this approach as a technologization of politics. Nothing could be further from my view. It is not about technocratizing politics, but about adjusting it, at the very least, and once and for all, to the standards that characterized full democracies which already exist, function, and were never considered technocratic. That would be the starting point, but the aim is to go much further, establishing new democratic standards, far stricter than those known to date. A kind of total quality management policy and absolutely minimization of risk geared towards generating a system and institution of excellence, something clearly possible technically, but unthinkable for the public and undesirable for politicians, at least until now. The real danger is not precisely a high level of institutional rigor, but the tolerated and recurrent structural informality in the exercise of power. Others may argue that this approach undermines popular sovereignty. However, the exact opposite is true. To associate the 21st century democracy exclusively with the act of voting, which, let's be honest, is exactly the same as talking about representative democracy in the old-fashioned way, is not insufficient. It is suicidal. Political power is exercised mostly outside the electoral cycle, unless we confuse government with permanent campaigning. In full democracies and in many flawed ones, although cheating is generally common in the latter, governments are only allowed to campaign within the framework of a specific election calls and for short periods, and are prohibited from doing so constantly and repeatedly. To those who think that my proposal could weaken popular sovereignty, I say it is quite the opposite. Strengthening parliaments, ensuring a free press, and especially institutionalizing the high levels of social control, taking the control of power engineering to the extreme to guarantee excellence in the exercise of public function and service does not weaken popular sovereignty. It ensures it, in addition to making it permanent. The goal is to move from intermittent popular sovereignty to active and continuous popular sovereignty, mediated by truly efficient and effective institutions. Today, clearly, this type of institutions, at least in flawed democracies, function in an inefficient way, an ineffective way, and in all democracies, even fully functioning ones, they are becoming increasingly obsolete. It is also not true that this approach reduces democratic conflict. Reducing democratic conflict is precisely what polarization does. It eliminates nuances, constructs artificial extremes, assigns everything good to one side and everything bad to the other, manipulates public opinion, and shuts down dialogue. That doesn't strengthen democracy. It empties it. A full democracy does not eliminate conflict. It makes it virtuous because it facilitates the management of differences through dialogue, institutional deliberation, and consensus building without denying diversity or imposing forced unanimity. The mere announcement of subjecting politics, the political and governing system, and politicians to highly complex engineering might be difficult to imagine. However, that is precisely the point. We were able to understand after World War II the need to be rigorous with the production of the atomic bomb, the most concentrated instrument of human destruction ever used before. Hiroshima and Nagasaki bear witness to this. The consequences were instant, massive and prolonged damage, physical, moral, and civilizational. The politics of malpractice, flawed political and governmental systems, and politicians who act in bad faith have a destructive capacity similar to that of nuclear weapons. They affect or can affect thousands, again, hundreds of thousands, millions, and even billions of people over long or short periods of time and of a massive scale. Their consequences are far-reaching, and they directly affect not only the nations that suffer them, but also their environment and often the entire world. Let me be clearer. We start from the premise that human error and bad faith are inevitable. Therefore, in the management system of the atomic bomb, we avoid relying exclusively on the virtues of the system operators, reinforcing the system's architecture. How does the security system work? With two key principles. First, extreme redundancy, which involves adopting multiple technical, human, and procedural layers, which are often omitted in flawed democracies. This implies, on one hand, no one decides alone, a recurrent practice in flawed democracies, characterized by heads of state and or government who concentrate power and avoid any interference from the rest of the political and governmental system, especially from those institutions that theoretically participate in the principle of check and balances. And on the other hand, no one executes without cross-validation, which implies taking advantage of the accumulated capacity of the deep state to legitimize the decision of political leaders, mediating the prior and subsequent implementation of both technical and institutional scrutiny processes, both within the executive branch of governments as well as at the parliamentary level, as well as mediating genuine social control. The other principle is that of institutionalizing distrust. The system does not presuppose permanent good faith. Classical administrative law assigns to the decision of the state at any level of government a presumption of validity or legitimacy. The question, however, is what happens when evidence shows that increasingly acts of administration and government are tainted by abuse of power. Do you know what is bias? This kind of bias is this? It occurs when governments say they are doing something for a purpose other than what they are actually pursuing. These are acts through which the pursuit of interest contrary to the public interest is hiding behind their declaration as interest in favor of the public interest. Do you remember when we mentioned the quality of the fuel supplied to the political and governmental system, the engine of our democracies? Well, that's exactly what I mean, and believe it's a very common practice in flawed democracies. I am going to give examples later, so you will understand this is not in the air. This is true, sadly. In short, if the handling of nuclear weapons requires a system designed to resist the wrong person, the practice of modern politics should also be designed to prevent a person who lacks the technical or moral suitability for the exercise of their office. However, nuclear weapons are governed today as an existential risk, while politics is conducted as if it were a merely rhetorical risk. Let's move on a little further. What is the origin of this idea that I present to you today? Where does it come from? So you will understand. Of course, I come from Argentina, so you will understand a lot of things that are related to this. But it's not an exception, Argentina, just an extreme, that's it. So, well, I consider myself a qualified witness to the functioning of politics, the political and governmental system, and the politicians of the Argentine Republic. And as such, I have seen and continue to see with my own eyes the very serious defects of those three dimensions. Democracy, as it has existed since its origins in Argentina,